If there's one thing James never expected to find in his garage, it was someone else's midlife crisis. Yet there it was, a shiny silver Lexus parked smugly in the middle of his sacred space, as if it had been personally invited by the universe to ruin his day. For a moment, James just stood there, slack-jawed, staring at the car like it might sprout legs and explain itself. Of course, it didn't. Cars don't talk. But apparently, neither did Karen, the self-appointed queen of entitlement who had decided that his garage was the perfect place to store her overpriced ego on wheels. To say James was confused would be an understatement. Was this some kind of avant-garde art installation? A new HOA initiative called Share Your Garage with a Stranger? Or maybe he'd been unknowingly cast in a reality show called Suburban Nightmares. When neighbors attack. Whatever it was, one thing was clear. This wasn't just a parking violation. This was a declaration of war. James had always believed that suburban life came with certain guarantees. Peace and quiet, predictable neighbors, and a garage that no one dared touch. It wasn't just a place to park his car. It was his fortress of solitude. A shrine to tools, half-finished projects, and boxes labeled miscellaneous that he swore he'd sort through someday. But now it was ground zero for Karen's audacious invasion. He approached the Lexus cautiously, as though it might bite him. No note on the windshield, no sign of damage or distress, just a luxury car sitting there like it owned the place. James checked his mailbox to make sure he hadn't accidentally driven into someone else's house. Nope, still his address, still his garage, still his problem. Is this some kind of prank? He muttered to himself, half expecting hidden cameras or Ashton Kutcher to jump out from behind a bush yelling, "You've been punked!" But no cameras appeared. No laughter echoed through the neighborhood. Just him and this ridiculous situation. James knocked on his neighbor's door to see if they knew anything about this automotive trespasser. His neighbor shrugged and suggested calling the HOA, Homeowners Association. Now, James had never been a fan of HOA meetings. They were less about solving problems and more about debating lawn height and mailbox colors. But desperate times called for desperate measures. The next morning, James contacted the HOA and explained the situation in painstaking detail. Their response? Less helpful than a vending machine that eats your quarters. "Oh, that's Karen's car," said Linda from the HOA board in a tone that suggested she'd rather be discussing flower arrangements than property disputes. "Karen? Who's Karen?" James asked. "She lives 3 houses down," Linda replied casually, as if this solved everything. "Well, could you tell Karen to move her car out of my garage?" Linda sighed deeply, as though James had just asked her to solve world hunger. "Karen says your garage is part of the shared community space under HOA guidelines." James blinked in disbelief. Shared community space? His garage? Did Karen think he lived in some kind of socialist utopia where garages were communal property? He hung up before Linda could spout more HOA nonsense and marched straight over to Karen's house. Karen answered the door wearing yoga pants and an expression that screamed entitlement. She didn't even wait for James to speak before launching into her spiel. "Oh, hi. You must be here about the garage situation. Listen, I've been parking there because my driveway is too small for my Lexus." James stared at her incredulously. "Your driveway is too small? That doesn't mean you can just annex my garage like it's Crimea." Karen waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, please, don't be dramatic. It's not like you're using it for anything important." "Not using it for anything important? It's my garage. It's attached to my house. What part of this doesn't scream private property to you?" Karen rolled her eyes as if James were being unreasonable. "Look, I'm sure we can work something out with the HOA." James stormed back home fuming but determined to reclaim his territory. He printed out copies of his property deed and highlighted the section that clearly defined his garage as his private space. Not some shared parking lot for Karen's luxury vehicle. At the next HOA meeting, James presented his case with all the fervor of a lawyer in a courtroom drama. He laid out maps, legal documents, and even photos of Karen's car blatantly occupying his garage without permission. Karen sat across from him with an air of indifference that could rival royalty at a peasant uprising. "I don't see what the big deal is," she said nonchalantly when James finished speaking. "The big deal," James replied through gritted teeth, "is that you're treating my property like your personal valet service." The HOA board members exchanged awkward glances before Linda finally spoke up. "Well, technically Karen isn't violating any specific HOA rules." James nearly fell out of his chair. Not violating any rules? Was he living in an alternate dimension where trespassing was perfectly acceptable? Karen smirked triumphantly as Linda adjourned the meeting without resolving anything. James left feeling defeated but far from ready to surrender. Over the next few weeks, Karen continued parking in James's garage, as if she had won some twisted version of Monopoly where garages were free spaces. Every time he confronted her or complained to the HOA, she brushed him off with excuses ranging from, "I'll move it soon," to, "You're being so territorial." James decided enough was enough when he found Karen had installed her own lock on his garage door without so much as asking permission. It wasn't just disrespectful, it was war. And thus began James's meticulous plan for revenge. A plan that would not only reclaim his garage, but also teach Karen a lesson she wouldn't forget anytime soon. James woke up the next morning with a renewed sense of purpose. If Karen wanted to play games, then James was ready to become the grandmaster. He wasn't just going to reclaim his garage. He was going to make Karen regret every smug smirk, every dismissive wave of her hand, and every audacious parking maneuver she had pulled. But first, he needed coffee. Revenge plans always required caffeine. As he sipped his coffee and stared out the window at Karen's Lexus, which had once again taken up residence in his garage, James began brainstorming. He considered a variety of options, ranging from passive-aggressive notes taped to the windshield to hiring a mariachi band to play outside Karen's house at 3 a.m. But no, this situation called for precision. A plan so airtight that even Karen's inflated sense of entitlement couldn't poke holes in it. Step 1. Gather evidence. James spent the next few days documenting Karen's parking habits like he was conducting a wildlife study. Every time she parked in his garage, he snapped photos from multiple angles. He even recorded videos of her brazenly walking away from the Lexus without so much as a glance back at the property she was illegally occupying. James felt like a private investigator in a cheesy crime drama, except instead of uncovering infidelity or corporate espionage, he was exposing suburban audacity. Step 2. Research the law. James dove headfirst into local ordinances and property regulations with the enthusiasm of someone who had just discovered their favorite Netflix series had 10 seasons. He learned about trespassing laws, vehicle abandonment statutes, and even obscure HOA bylaws that Linda had conveniently failed to mention during their last meeting. His favorite discovery? A little-known rule that allowed property owners to report unauthorized vehicles as abandoned if they remained on private property for more than 48 hours without permission. Karen's Lexus had been squatting in his garage for weeks. She practically qualified for historical landmark status at this point. Step 3. Prepare for confrontation. James knew that simply reporting Karen's car wouldn't be enough. He needed to make sure every detail was airtight before involving authorities. He printed out copies of his property deed, highlighted sections of local law that supported his case, and compiled a folder so thick it could double as a weapon if things got physical. Not that he expected it to. Karen didn't seem like the type to throw punches. She preferred throwing tantrums. With his evidence in hand and his legal knowledge sharpened to a fine point, James decided it was time to confront Karen one last time before escalating matters. He marched over to her house with all the determination of someone delivering bad news wrapped in righteous fury. Karen answered the door with her usual air of indifference, her yoga pants now upgraded to designer sweatpants that probably cost more than James's monthly mortgage payment. "Oh, hi, James," she said casually, as though they were old friends catching up instead of adversaries locked in an increasingly ridiculous feud. "Karen," James began, his voice steady but firm, "this has gone on long enough. You need to move your car out of my garage." Karen sighed dramatically, as though James had just asked her to solve quantum physics equations on the spot. "James, I thought we already discussed this. Your garage is part of the shared community space. No, James replied sharply, holding up his folder like it was Excalibur. This is my property deed. It clearly states that my garage is private property, not shared space. Karen glanced at the folder with all the enthusiasm of someone being handed jury duty paperwork. Well, I don't know what you expect me to do about it. I expect you, James said through gritted teeth, to stop treating my garage like your personal parking lot. Karen rolled her eyes so hard James worried they might get stuck. You're being so territorial. And you're being so entitled, James shot back. Karen shrugged as though entitlement were a badge of honor she wore proudly. Look, I don't have time for this right now. James stared at her in disbelief as she closed the door in his face without another word. It was official. Karen wasn't just ignoring him. She was actively daring him to escalate, and escalate he did. James wasted no time filing an official report with local authorities under the vehicle abandonment statute he had discovered during his research binge. He provided them with photos, videos, and copies of his property deed, all meticulously organized and labeled like he was submitting evidence for a high-profile court case. 2 days later, a tow truck arrived at James's house like an avenging angel sent by bureaucracy itself. The driver inspected the Lexus briefly before hooking it up and hauling it away without ceremony. As the car disappeared down the street toward its new home at an impound lot, James felt an overwhelming sense of satisfaction wash over him. A feeling so pure it could rival winning the lottery or finding money in an old coat pocket. Karen didn't notice her car was missing until later that afternoon when she strolled over to James's garage, expecting her usual VIP parking experience, only to find an empty space staring back at her like an accusation. She stormed over to James's house in full meltdown mode. Arms flailing, voice raised, and entitlement levels cranked up to maximum capacity. "Where is my car?" she demanded as though James had stolen it himself. "It's been impounded," James replied calmly, holding up copies of the report he had filed with local authorities. "You can retrieve it after paying the fines for trespassing on private property." Karen looked like she might explode on the spot, a volcano of indignation ready to erupt all over James's front lawn. "You can't do this. I'll call the HOA. Go ahead," James said with a shrug. "But I think you'll find they don't have jurisdiction over local law enforcement." Karen stomped off, muttering threats under her breath about lawsuits and revenge plots that sounded more like bad soap opera dialogue than actual plans. Meanwhile, James returned to his now empty garage with a sense of triumph so profound it felt almost spiritual. For once in this absurd saga, justice had prevailed, and Karen's reign of entitlement had finally been dethroned. Karen was not the type to take defeat gracefully. No, she was the type to double down, dig in her heels, and make everyone else miserable until she got her way. So, when she realized her precious Lexus had been towed thanks to James's meticulous legal maneuvering, she didn't reflect on her actions or consider apologizing. Instead, she declared war, or at least what she thought was war, which mostly involved passive-aggressive antics and poorly thought-out schemes. The first sign of Karen's retaliation came the very next morning. James woke up to find a handwritten note taped to his front door. The handwriting was suspiciously loopy, like someone trying too hard to seem friendly, but the message was anything but, "You'll regret this. HOA rules are on my side. Move out if you can't handle living in a community." James read the note twice, then laughed so hard he nearly spilled his coffee. "Move out," he muttered to himself. "Because I want to park in my own garage? Sure, Karen. Let me just pack my bags and hand you the deed while I'm at it." But Karen wasn't done yet. Later that day, James noticed that his trash cans had mysteriously disappeared from the curb. At first, he thought it might have been a mistake. Maybe the garbage collectors had taken them by accident? But then he spotted them 3 houses down, conveniently sitting in Karen's driveway like they'd been kidnapped and held for ransom. "Oh, for crying out loud," James muttered as he marched over to retrieve his bins. Karen happened to be outside watering her plants, or pretending to water them. James suspected it was just an excuse to monitor his reaction. She greeted him with a saccharine smile that could have curdled milk. "Good morning, James," she chirped. "Lovely weather we're having, isn't it?" James didn't bother with pleasantries. "Karen, Why are my trash cans in your driveway? Karen tilted her head innocently. Oh, those are yours? I thought they were abandoned since they were just sitting there on the curb. They were on the curb because it's trash day, James replied through gritted teeth. Well, Karen said with a shrug, you really should keep better track of your belongings. James grabbed his trash cans and walked away before he said something that would land him in anger management classes. It was clear now Karen wasn't just petty. She was committed to being petty. Over the next few days, Karen escalated her antics with the enthusiasm of someone auditioning for a reality show called Neighbors Behaving Badly. She filed multiple complaints with the HOA about James's lawn being too green. Yes, apparently that was a thing, and accused him of violating noise ordinances because his garage door opener was too loud. She even went as far as leaving fake parking tickets on his car windshield when it was parked in his own driveway. James couldn't decide whether to be annoyed or impressed by her creativity. She's like a toddler throwing a tantrum, he told his friend Mike over beers one evening. Except instead of crying and kicking, she's weaponizing bureaucracy. Mike shook his head sympathetically. You need to hit her where it hurts. And where would that be? James asked. Her ego, Mike replied without hesitation. It was sound advice, and James decided it was time to take action. Not out of malice. Okay, maybe a little malice. But because Karen needed to learn that actions have consequences. The opportunity came sooner than expected when James noticed something peculiar about Karen's front yard. An unauthorized garden gnome display. Now, under normal circumstances, James wouldn't have cared if Karen decorated her yard with gnomes, flamingos, or even a life-size statue of Elvis Presley. But these weren't normal circumstances, and Karen had made it abundantly clear that she loved weaponizing HOA rules against others. So James did what any reasonable person would do. He read through the HOA handbook until he found a regulation about lawn ornaments exceeding height limits. Then he filed an official complaint against Karen's gnome collection. The HOA responded swiftly, for once, sending Karen a notice that her gnomes were in violation and needed to be removed immediately or face fines. The next morning, James watched from his window as Karen furiously dismantled her gnome army while muttering curses under her breath. But James wasn't done yet. He decided to take things one step further by hosting a neighborhood barbecue, a friendly gathering designed to highlight Karen's antics without directly calling her out. He invited everyone on the block except Karen, because obviously. And when people asked why she wasn't there, James simply shrugged and said, "Oh, I figured she'd be too busy filing complaints about someone else's lawn." The barbecue was a resounding success. Neighbors shared stories about their own run-ins with Karen, everything from stolen Amazon packages to unsolicited lectures about recycling. And by the end of the evening, it became clear that Karen wasn't just James's problem. She was everyone's problem. Word spread quickly throughout the neighborhood about Karen's behavior, and soon enough, even the HOA board started distancing themselves from her. Linda, the same Linda who had previously defended Karen, began responding to her complaints with curt emails like, "We'll look into it." Karen's reign of terror began crumbling faster than a poorly built sandcastle during high tide. Her complaints were dismissed outright. Her attempts at retaliation were met with collective eye rolls from neighbors who had finally united against her nonsense. And as for James, he reclaimed his garage without further incident and enjoyed watching Karen stew in her own frustration from afar. Sure, there were still occasional passive-aggressive notes left on his doorstep, including one particularly memorable one that read, "You're ruining this community." But they only served as reminders of how far he'd come in defeating suburban tyranny. In the end, justice prevailed, not because James fought fire with fire, though he certainly did, but because sometimes all it takes is standing up for yourself against someone who thinks they can get away with anything. And if that person happens to be named Karen, well, all the better. James thought the battle was over. Karen's gnomes had been evicted, her complaints dismissed, and her reputation as the neighborhood tyrant thoroughly dismantled. But Karen wasn't the kind of person to let things go. No, Karen was the kind of person who saw every minor inconvenience as a personal affront and every defeat as an opportunity for escalation. And James? Well, James was about to find out just how far Karen was willing to go. It started with a package. James came home one evening to find a large box sitting on his porch. addressed to him but clearly not something he had ordered. It was suspiciously heavy, wrapped in layers of duct tape, and smelled faintly of vinegar. James poked at it cautiously, half expecting it to explode or release a swarm of angry bees. Instead, when he finally opened it, he found a pile of moldy vegetables and a note that read, "Rotten, just like your attitude." James stared at the box in disbelief. Was this Karen's idea of revenge? A passive-aggressive compost delivery? He chuckled to himself as he dragged the box to the curb. "She's really scraping the bottom of the barrel now," he muttered. But Karen wasn't done. The next morning, James woke up to find his lawn covered in pink flamingos. Dozens of them, planted haphazardly like some kind of tacky invasion force. Each flamingo had a sign hanging from its neck that read, "HOA approved." James couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. Is this supposed to intimidate me? He wondered aloud as he started pulling them out one by one. Karen watched from her porch, sipping coffee and smirking like she just won an Oscar for Best Villain in a suburban drama. "Nice decorations," she called out cheerfully. James waved one of the flamingos at her like it was a white flag of surrender. "You're really committed to this, aren't you?" Karen shrugged innocently. "Just trying to brighten up the neighborhood." The flamingo fiasco was annoying, sure, but it wasn't enough to rattle James. He'd dealt with worse from Karen. This was practically amateur hour compared to her previous antics. But then came the sprinklers. One evening, as James was enjoying a quiet moment on his porch, he noticed something strange happening in his yard. His sprinklers, had turned on without him activating them. And not just turned on, they were spraying water directly onto his driveway in what could only be described as an aggressive jet stream. James rushed over to investigate and found that someone had tampered with his sprinkler system, redirecting it toward his driveway instead of his lawn. And by someone, he meant Karen, because who else would have both the audacity and the free time? "Seriously," James muttered as he turned off the water and inspected the damage. It wasn't catastrophic, just another petty inconvenience designed to test his patience. The next day, James confronted Karen about the sprinklers while she was out walking her dog, a Pomeranian named Princess who looked just as entitled as her owner. "Karen," he began, "did you mess with my sprinklers?" Karen feigned innocence so poorly that even Princess looked embarrassed for her. "I don't know what you're talking about." James held up a piece of sprinkler tubing that had clearly been tampered with. "Really? Because this looks like your handiwork." Karen shrugged nonchalantly. "Maybe you should invest in better landscaping equipment." James sighed deeply, realizing that reasoning with Karen was like trying to teach algebra to a goldfish. It wasn't going to happen. But if Karen wanted war, James was ready to fight back. And this time, he wasn't playing defense. James decided it was time for some strategic retaliation. Not out of malice. Okay, maybe a little malice. But because Karen needed a taste of her own medicine. He started small. Every time Karen left her trash cans out past pickup day, which she did frequently, James would move them back onto her porch with sticky notes that read, "Courtesy reminder from your friendly neighbor." Karen didn't appreciate the gesture. She stormed over to James's house one afternoon holding one of the sticky notes like it was evidence in a criminal trial. "Stop touching my property," she demanded. James smiled politely. "I'm just trying to help you follow HOA guidelines." Karen glared at him with all the fury of someone who had just been told their coupon expired. "You're unbelievable." "Thank you," James replied cheerfully before closing the door in her face. Next came Operation Lawn Lights, a brilliant scheme involving solar-powered garden lights shaped like tiny gnomes. Because why not? James strategically placed them along his property line facing Karen's house so that every night, her front yard would be illuminated by an army of glowing gnomes staring directly at her windows. Karen complained about the lights immediately, but since they were technically on James's property and within HOA regulations, there wasn't much she could do except stew in frustration. The final blow came when James discovered Karen's Achilles heel, her obsession with appearances. Karen prided herself on being perceived as classy and sophisticated, despite all evidence to the contrary. So James decided to hit her where it hurt most, her image. He organized another neighborhood barbecue, but this time added a twist. An impromptu awards ceremony where neighbors voted on titles like Best Lawn, Friendliest Neighbor, and Most Creative Decor. Unsurprisingly, Karen didn't win anything, but she did receive an honorary mention for Most Persistent Complainer. The look on Karen's face when her name was announced was priceless. A mix of shock, indignation, and barely contained rage. She stormed out of the barbecue without saying a word while everyone else laughed and clapped. For James, victory never tasted so sweet. Not because he had defeated Karen, though he definitely had, but because he had proven that even the most entitled people can be taken down with enough patience and creativity. And as he stood in his perfectly reclaimed garage later that evening sipping another well-earned beer, James couldn't help but smile at how far he'd come. From victim to victor in one ridiculous suburban saga. James thought he had finally reached the end of his feud with Karen. The glowing gnome lights had been a stroke of genius. The barbecue awards ceremony had been a masterpiece of petty revenge, and Karen's stormy exit from the neighborhood gathering had felt like the final curtain on their ridiculous suburban drama. But, as James had come to learn, Karen was like a bad rash. You could treat it, but it always found a way to come back worse than before. The first sign of trouble came when James noticed something strange about his mailbox. It wasn't just stuffed with junk mail and HOA newsletters. It was overflowing with catalogs for luxury cars, high-end furniture, and spa retreats. At first, James thought it was just an innocent mistake. Maybe someone at the post office had mixed up addresses. But then he noticed the name on the catalogs, James Garage Hog Thompson. Karen had apparently taken it upon herself to sign James up for every mailing list she could find, adding humiliating nicknames to ensure maximum embarrassment. James flipped through the pile, shaking his head at titles like How to Live Lavishly Without Annoying Your Neighbors and Home Decor for People Who Think They're Better Than Everyone Else. Creative, James muttered as he tossed the catalogs into his recycling bin. But not exactly groundbreaking. Karen's next move was far more audacious. One morning, James woke up to find a giant inflatable flamingo sitting in his front yard. A garish monstrosity that towered over his house and looked like it belonged at a tacky beach resort. Attached to the flamingo was a banner that read, Winner of Most Territorial Neighbor Award. James stared at the flamingo in disbelief, then burst out laughing. She's really outdone herself this time, he said, snapping a photo to send to his friend Mike. Mike's response was immediate. You have to keep it. That's art. But James wasn't about to let Karen turn his yard into her personal canvas for passive-aggressive performance art. He called a local removal service and had the flamingo deflated and hauled away within hours. Karen watched from her porch, arms crossed and lips pursed in frustration as her masterpiece was dismantled. You didn't appreciate my gift? She called out sarcastically. Not really my style, James replied, giving her a thumbs up before heading back inside. Karen's antics continued over the next few weeks. Always ridiculous, always petty, and always just annoying enough to keep James on edge. She started leaving cryptic notes on his car windshield with messages like, nice parking job, even when his car was perfectly centered in his driveway, and hope your garage is happy now. She even went as far as planting weeds in his flower beds under cover of darkness. A move so absurd that James couldn't help but laugh when he discovered it. But while Karen was busy waging her one-woman war against James, she failed to notice that her own reputation in the neighborhood was crumbling faster than a sandcastle during high tide. The barbecue awards ceremony had been just the beginning. Neighbors were now openly sharing stories about Karen's behavior in group chats and during casual conversations at the local coffee shop. She stole my Amazon package last month, one neighbor complained. She told me my lawn ornaments were tacky, another added. She tried to charge me for using her Wi-Fi, someone else chimed in. The stories piled up until Karen became less of a person and more of a suburban legend, the kind of figure people whispered about but avoided at all costs. Even Linda from the HOA board started distancing herself from Karen, responding to her complaints with curt emails like, "We'll look into it." James couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction as he watched Karen's influence dwindle. For once, he didn't have to do anything. Karen was digging her own grave with every petty stunt she pulled. But then came the final act. the moment when Karen's reign of entitlement truly came crashing down. One evening, James noticed flashing lights outside Karen's house. At first, he thought it might be an ambulance or fire truck. Maybe Princess had eaten something she shouldn't have, which wouldn't be surprising given her owner's lack of common sense. But as James stepped outside to investigate, he saw two police officers standing on Karen's porch while she gesticulated wildly and shouted something about harassment. Apparently, Karen had taken her feud with James too far by attempting to sabotage his sprinkler system again. This time by dumping buckets of paint into his water lines in an effort to ruin his lawn. Unfortunately for Karen, she hadn't accounted for the fact that James had installed security cameras after her first sprinkler stunt. James watched from a safe distance as one of the officers held up a tablet displaying footage of Karen sneaking onto James's property with her paint buckets in hand. Her expression shifted from indignation to panic faster than Princess could bark at passing cars. "This is ridiculous," Karen exclaimed. "He set me up." The officer raised an eyebrow. "So you're saying you didn't dump paint into his sprinklers?" Karen hesitated for just a moment too long before blurting out, I was trying to teach him a lesson." "Well," said the officer dryly, "looks like you'll be learning one instead." Karen was issued multiple citations for trespassing and property damage, and while she wasn't arrested outright, the incident marked the beginning of her downfall. Word spread quickly throughout the neighborhood about what had happened, and soon enough, even her staunchest defenders, if there were any left, stopped taking her seriously. As for James, he finally got what he'd been fighting for all along: peace and quiet. His garage remained untouched, his lawn recovered from its brief flamingo infestation, and his mailbox returned to its normal state of boring bills and grocery coupons. Karen eventually moved out of the neighborhood under mysterious circumstances. Rumor had it she couldn't handle being ostracized by everyone around her. And while James would never admit it out loud, he couldn't help but feel just a little bit victorious every time he looked at his now empty garage and remembered everything it had taken to reclaim it. James could hardly believe it when the moving truck pulled up in front of Karen's house. He watched from his porch, sipping his coffee with the satisfaction of a man who had survived the suburban equivalent of a war. Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of entitlement, was finally leaving. It felt like the closing scene of a movie where the villain is defeated and the hero gets to ride off into the sunset. Or, in James's case, sit in his garage without fear of invasion. Karen's departure wasn't exactly graceful. She barked orders at the movers like a drill sergeant who had just discovered her troops were incompetent. Boxes were stacked haphazardly. Princess barked incessantly from her carrier, and Karen herself paced back and forth muttering about ungrateful neighbors and a community that doesn't appreciate quality. James couldn't help but chuckle as he imagined what Karen's Yelp review of the neighborhood would look like. Too many rules. Not enough respect for Lexus owners. As the movers loaded the last box into the truck, Karen turned to give one final glare at James's house. He raised his coffee mug in a mock toast, smiling innocently as if to say, "Good riddance." She huffed dramatically before climbing into her car. Yes, she had managed to retrieve her precious Lexus from impound and sped off down the street without so much as a goodbye. The neighborhood felt lighter almost immediately. People began chatting more freely at the mailbox. Kids played in their yards without fear of Karen yelling at them for being too loud. And even Linda from the HOA seemed less stressed during meetings. It was as if Karen's departure had lifted a dark cloud that had been hovering over their little suburban paradise. James thought that was the end of it, that he could finally enjoy his quiet life without any more drama. But then came the surprise twist. Karen's house wasn't empty for long. Within weeks, a new family moved in. A cheerful couple with 2 young kids and a golden retriever named Max who wagged his tail so enthusiastically it looked like he might take off. The new neighbors were everything Karen wasn't. Friendly, considerate, and completely uninterested in starting feuds over lawn ornaments or parking spaces. They introduced themselves to everyone on the block, hosted a casual meet-and-greet barbecue, with actual invitations instead of passive-aggressive banners, and even complimented James on his garage setup when they stopped by to say hello. "You've got a great space here," said Tom, the new neighbor. "I've been meaning to set up something similar for my tools." James grinned. Well, it's nice to finally have neighbors who don't think my garage is public property. Tom laughed. Yeah, we heard some stories about the previous owner. Sounds like she was colorful. That's one way to put it, James replied. Life returned to normal, or at least as normal as life could be after surviving months of Karen-induced chaos. James spent his evenings tinkering in his garage without interruption, enjoying the peace and quiet that he had fought so hard to reclaim. Every now and then, he'd glance at the spot where Karen's Lexus used to sit and feel a small surge of triumph. But while Karen was gone from their neighborhood, her legacy lived on in the form of cautionary tales told during HOA meetings and neighborhood gatherings. Remember when she tried to turn someone else's garage into her personal parking space? Linda would say with a laugh. Unbelievable. James became something of a local legend himself, not for being territorial, despite Karen's accusations, but for standing up to her nonsense with humor and persistence. Neighbors often asked him for advice on dealing with difficult people, and he'd respond with gems like, document everything, know your rights, and never underestimate the power of glowing gnome lights. One day, while chatting with Tom over beers in his backyard, James reflected on everything that had happened. You know, he said, I never thought I'd have to fight so hard just to park my car in my own garage. Tom nodded sympathetically. Suburban life isn't always as peaceful as people think. True, James agreed. Then he raised his bottle in a toast. To good neighbors and fewer Karens. Tom laughed and clinked his bottle against James's. I'll drink to that. As James sat back and enjoyed the evening breeze, he realized something important. While revenge might be satisfying in the moment, true victory comes from reclaiming your peace and maybe sharing a few laughs along the way. And so ended James's saga. A tale of entitlement, perseverance, and one man's determination to protect what was his. It wasn't always easy, but it was worth it. Because sometimes, standing up for yourself isn't just about winning. It's about making sure everyone knows you're not someone to mess with. If you enjoyed this story, and let's be honest, who doesn't love a good revenge tale? Don't forget to like this post. Share it with your friends who've dealt with their own Karens or entitled neighbors. They'll appreciate knowing they're not alone. And hey, leave a comment below if you've got a story like James's. We'd love to hear it. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe for more tales of suburban drama, served with a side of humor. Until next time.